Today I'm going to be showing you how to do one of our newer style stuffies. It is called a floppy stuffy, and we have a few of these animals out already, and there is definitely more to come. They are they're laying on their bellies, which is why we call them floppy. This one is made in 5 hoopings, and the fun thing about the floppy stuffies is the body is made into hoopings. So this guy is about 15 or 16 inches long, and it was made in the 5x7. So we're creating the body and then the head in 2 separate hoopings, but with one larger piece of fabric. So you can make really big stuffies with smaller sized hoop, which is always a plus. Supplies we're going to need for our project today is our threads and our stabilizer, and of course our designs. We are also going to need fabrics. So the important thing about the floppy style stuffies is you need a larger piece of fabric. So we are going to be stitching the head on one side and the body on the other side with 2 separate hoops. So you're going to need fabric that is big enough to do 2 hoops. So it's going to be twice as long as your hoop. So I have mine about 14 inches wide plus seam allowances for my 5x7. And you're going to need that piece for the front as well as one for the back. You will also need additional fabric for your legs and your ears and your tail. I am going to use a printed fabric for the inside of the ears to give it a little bit of dimension, and then I have a cream fleece for the face applique and the tail tip. And then because we're using a fluffy fur for the mane, we're going to need some water soluble stabilizer to keep everything up above that fur pile. I have my hoop 1 loaded into my machine. I chose the open version, which is going to have little openings on the paws so you can stuff it afterwards. I'm a big fan of the open versions. I find it makes it a lot easier for assembling your stuffy if you don't have to deal with the bulk of a stuffed limb. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch step 1 directly on the fabric, as well as some water soluble stabilizer to help it not get caught up in the fur. So we've stitched our step onto stabilizer and we're ready to move on to the detail steps. I stitched step 2, which is the toe detail, and 3, which is the ear detail. And moving on to step 4, we are going to be doing the back of the ear. I'm going to be using a print just for some visual interest. You can use what you would like, and we're going to place them right sides together after I remove all that excess water soluble. And then step 5 will be the same thing for the paws, where you lay right sides together. So that finishes up hoop 1, and you can take that out of the hoop and restabilize to do hoop 2. Loaded in hoop 2, again I'm using the open version, and I'm going to stitch my step 1 placement right on top of my stabilizer and my fabric. Because there's only a tiny amount of detail, I'm just going to use a scrap piece of water soluble instead of a full piece, but if you want to put a full piece on before stitching down the step 1, you certainly can. So we've tacked down using step 1, and I'm just going to put a little bit of water soluble stabilizer over that for the details and go ahead and stitch step 2. So the details on step 2 have been stitched, and we are just going to take away any of the excess water soluble stabilizer. And again, we're going to put right sides together. I'm just going to fold this piece over. You will want to pay attention to your nap direction if it matters. This is kind of a whatever way goes, so it doesn't really matter. But if your fabric has a particular direction of the pile, you would want to cut that off and flip it, but this one doesn't seem to matter, so I'm just going to flip it over, and then we're going to run our step 3, I believe. Yep. Final outline around the edge. So we have our final outline stitch. Again, there's a small jump stitch there, so it leaves an opening so I can stuff after. We can go ahead and unhoop and rehoop for step 3. I'm going to see if the tail will fit in the rest of my hoop, as I don't have a standard 5x7, so I might be able to save some stabilizer and put it up top. So I have room on my larger hoop to do hoop 3 in the same hoop that I did hoop 2. If you don't, then you can just re-hoop a fresh piece of stabilizer. So I'm just going to have my foxtail up here. So we are just starting hoop 3 fresh. If you're really experienced, you could even merge these limb pieces all into one super big hoop if you have that capacity. So I've laid my tail fabric right side up over the placement. I'm being a little picky and trying to use scraps so I don't have to cut another piece. So I'm going to be tight there, but you can cut it bigger if you prefer. And just run step 1 onto your fabric and stabilizer. So we tack the tail down on the stabilizer, and our next step is going to be our placement for the tip of our tail applique. So I'm going to go ahead and run step 2. So you can see there where step 2 stitched out where we're going to have our tail applique, and I'm just using a fleece. Just going to place it right side up over the placement and tack it down with step 3. So we have that tacked down. There is a feature zigzag stitch on the outer perimeter. If you had used a woven, that will help prevent fraying. And it also indicates we don't need to cut a applique there. You can just leave that longer. If you have a huge amount of excess, you may want to trim some away. But I'm just going to leave that and just trim as tight as I can to these stitches. My favorite scissors to use for applique are my double angled. I'll link them in the comments, and I'm just going to trim away there. So you got that trimmed as closely as I can, and we're going to run the satin stitch step 4 to cover those raw edges. I'm going to put some water soluble over it to help keep that pile down so that we get a nice clean satin stitch with no fur sticking out of it. So we have our satin stitch done over our applique, and we're going to add our backing right side down and run our final outline. So we finished up step 5, which is our tail. Again, I use the open version, and there's a jump there to leave a space so that I can stuff it after assembly. So we can take this out of the hoop. We can work on trimming all of our limbs and getting them turned around, and we'll hoop 4, which is going to be the back end of the Stuffie. So I've cut out and trimmed all of my limbs that we did in hoops 1 through 3 and turned them right side out. We have our front paws, which are more of a C shape, and the back paws are more of an S, backwards S shape. They've got a double turn. The tail and the ears, I've made the ears with the black detail on the outside and the print on the inside, and I've taken them and folded them a third of the way over, mirror imaged, so that they can go on our fox with a little bit of dimension. I have loaded hoop 4, which is the back end of our fox. Basically, we're just going to be attaching the tail and the back legs and the front legs to this hoop. So we just are going to lay our fabric down. Now we have our extra long fabric. So we want to leave area in the front to do the face. So when we lay down our fabric, we want our excess fabric to be over the front of the machine, because that's where our face is going to be done in our next hoop. So we want to make sure that we have the fabric left over for that. So you can lay your fabric with the excess over the front of the hoop and then go ahead and stitch step 1 directly onto your fabric and stabilizer. So I've just secured this to the stabilizer, and step 2 is just going to be our tack down for limbs. I wouldn't ordinarily use water soluble here, but because it is showing you where all the limbs are, I'm going to use it just so you can really see the limbs and where they should go. So it's your choice if you use it or not. You don't really need to hide the stitches, or lift the stitches, but this will let you be able to see in the video where the stitches are. So I've stitched step 2, which stitches our 2 markers, which are going to be used to line up our hoop 5 for our face with the body, and then our arm, our back leg, our tail, our other back leg, and our front leg. And we're going to go ahead and tack those down. That will be with your next step, starting with step 3, and it's going to start on this side and go around this way. If you're unsure of what they're supposed to look like, I always lay them the way I want them to look when they're done. So our more C-shaped paw on the front, and our more S-shaped paws on the back. We can just set our ears aside. We won't be using those until we do the head part. And then, of course, our tail. And then as I tack them down, I just pretend like that line is a mirror, and I just flip it over and tack it down there. Now, water-soluble scraps over top of that will help you if you're using a furry fabric. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It'll depend on your comfort level of dealing with the furry fabrics. But I just do those one at a time, so I will just take all of those off and tack down one at a time. So it's important when you add your limbs in that you don't put them in front of your needle foot here, that you put them underneath your needle foot. You don't want that to get caught up underneath the foot, and then it'll either get caught or it'll just push your limb out of the way, and then you won't be able to have it tacked down. You'll just have to start again. So again, if you're new to using furry fabrics, the water-soluble stabilizer on top will really help you see what you're doing. So we've gone around and tacked down all of the limbs. Some of the limbs will go down one way, like this one goes up this way and then back. Same with this one, just to move it out of the way of crossing over those limbs. So you can flip them over and make sure they look the way you would like them to look when you're done. And we can remove this excess water soluble. You don't really need that, but that's your call. And now we just have to add the back to this back portion. So the biggest thing you want to do is make sure that none of your limbs are in the way of that original final outline. These back S-shaped toes are probably the most dangerous ones, so you could pin or tape. I use painter's tape, or some of our testers will just take a needle and thread and sort of baste those into the center, or you can just stop as you go around and make sure that they are not in the way of the final outline. So the backing is going to be the same thing as the front. We want to match up our back end with what we have on the hoop with our excess fabric on the front of the hoop, so we have room for the head. We are going to run step 8, which will be the final outline of the back half. It will leave an opening between the front paw and the back paw for turning, and we just want to make sure that all of our limbs are tucked inside so that they don't get caught in our final outline. So we finished step 8, which just stitched all the way around, and we are not going to stitch step 9. It's just a little stop star so it doesn't recenter over all that bulk and rip your project out of the hoop. So we're just going to take this out of the hoop, but we're not going to trim anything. We're just going to re-hoop another piece of stabilizer so we can add this whole piece to our next hooping. So I've gone ahead and loaded our final hoop 5. Step 1 you're going to do right on your stabilizer, and all it is going to be is 2 little markers that we're going to use to match up with the 2 markers that we stitched on our hoop 4. So we have our body here and there's 2 markers. So all we're going to do is lay those markers right on top of the markers that are stitched on the stabilizer, and that will line up our head with our body. Okay, so we have our step 1 markers in place. So we're going to take our body that we did in hoop 4, and on the back of it there are 2 markers that will match up with these markers here. So I just take the back as best I can and just kind of stick my finger there so it sticks out, and I lay it down as close as I can on top of that. And I just take a pin and I pin just outside of the stitching area. You don't have to pin, you can just lay them down. So same thing on this side. I have my little marker from hoop 4, lay it down as best as I can on top of the marker there, and then pin outside of the stitching area. Now you can go on and stitch step 2, but I'm a stickler for making sure things are right. So my preferred method is to go ahead and go back, whoop, catch my leg there, and re-stitch my step 1. So I have the backing part flipped out of the way, so I just have the front. Okay, and we can tuck those little limbs inside our body. Don't have to deal with them in the way. So I can visually see that the marker that was stitched in hoop 4, so our body hoop, is directly under the needle when starting our step 1. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch that, and it should stitch almost exactly over top of it. And again, I'm just going to manually pause here, make sure my marker is right underneath there. It was close enough really. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I like perfect. And I'm going to make sure that's right underneath and tack that down. Now, that's an optional step. It's just a way that I like to double check, triple check really, because there is a double check. So step 2 is just your double check lines, and they will stitch right on top of your lines that you stitch on your step 1 placement of your body hoop, so hoop 4. So they're just a few stitches, 16 in total on my machine, and they will just double check that you have your Stuffie lined up before you get too far into it. If any of these aren't matching, you just carefully unpick them and restart on the matching process. So if they're not exactly on top, that's just going to be a tiny bit that it's off, and that's not going to make a difference. But if they're quite a bit off, it is going to make a big difference, especially if they have details that match up. But this one is a little more lenient there. Okay, so our step 2 just did a little tiny thing, and you might be able to see there, it's maybe a millimeter off on mine, and I'm not going to fret about that, but if it bothers you, you can take it out. I can't even see it on that side with all the fur, but I'm happy with that placement. If you're not happy, if it's really far off, then you definitely want to unpick and restitch, but as long as they're very close, then it would be fine. So now that we know our head is approximately in the right spot, you can go ahead and stitch step 3, which will tack down your head fabric to the stabilizer. You want to make sure the backing that you added in hoop 4 is flipped out of the way. You only want to be stitching on one layer of fabric. So we've stitched that step to tack it down, and our next step is going to be our placement for our face applique. So step 4, you can just go ahead and stitch. That has shown us where to place our face applique. I am using a cream colored fleece that matches the tip of my tail. I also stabilized it with some fusible mesh just to control the stretch. Not usually a big deal on a fleece, but if you're doing a face, I prefer to do that because it really gives it some extra support, and then the face looks really, really nice stitched out. So we lay that over top of our placement and stitch step 5 to tack it down. So we have our applique fabric for our face tacked down. Again, there is the zigzag feature around the outer perimeter, so that way if you have a woven that's going to fray, it will help prevent that, and it also indicates that you don't need to trim very tightly there. You can clean up any extra if you want, but I'm just going to cut as closely as I can along the straight stitch line there, again using my double angled. I've got that trimmed as closely as I can here, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch step 6, which will be our satin stitch finish along the top of the face. So we finished up the satin stitch, and we're going to stitch step 7, which is going to be the placement for both of our ears. So step 8 and 9 will tack down our ears. We're going to lay our ears face up. They're going to be added like an applique, so we're going to tack them down, and then we're going to trim away the excess and then satin stitch over the raw edge. So I have both of my ears tacked down. I'm going to trim those ears as close as I can underneath the tack down line, and then we will stitch satin stitch over top of them to hide those raw edges. So I've got those trimmed as closely as I can. I have a thread matching my fur fabric to cover that up, and then I'm just going to put some water-soluble scrap over top and stitch our satin stitch step 10 over our ears to secure them in place. So we've got the satin stitch done over our ears, and our next step is step 11, which is our optional eyelashes. I'm going to stitch them on my guy, but if you want to skip them, you can go on to step 12, which will be the main part of the eye, and then step 13 is the nose. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch all of those steps. Okay, so we've gotten all of our details stitched, and we have step 14, which just pulls your machine out away from the bulk and gives you the opportunity to fold back your fabric without your fabric being caught on the flap that is flapped back. So you can stitch step 14 or not, but you just want to make sure that you have this flapped back before you move on to step 16. So when you move to step 16, it doesn't catch on the fabric that you have flapped backwards. So we're almost finished. We just have to stitch our step 15, which is going to be the final outline around the head. So we have our final outline done, step 15. Step 16 is just a stopping marker so that we don't have our machine recenter into the bulk of the limbs there. Our opening is on our previous hoop, so you can now take this out and remove all your excess stabilizer, trim, and turn it right side out. So we've got our fox all turned out and stuffed. I stuffed the body through the side opening, and then I also stuffed the limbs in the small openings and closed them up. So we hope you enjoyed doing this tutorial with us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask below and let us know if there are any specific animals you'd like to see as floppy stuffies in the future. Happy stitching, guys!